The millionaire sent a Bible to the poor librarian as her last wish on her deathbed. The librarian doesn't understand until she starts reading what is scribbled in the pages. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Eleanor Aldridge lay in her dimly lit bedroom, her breaths coming slow and shallow. Outside the window, evening shadows lengthened, stretching across the frost-tipped fields. Inside, her room held an air of stately elegance, rich mahogany furnishings, oil paintings on the walls, the soft glow of the firelight casting deep shadows over everything. Yet there was a palpable stillness, as if even the walls knew the weight of her unspoken thoughts. With a trembling hand, Eleanor reached under her pillow and pulled out an old Bible, its leather cover worn and scarred, its pages yellowed with time. She ran her thumb along its spine, feeling the texture of something familiar, private. This Bible had been with her through countless years, holding secrets she had guarded fiercely. But tonight, as her time ebbed, she knew it was no longer hers to keep. "Maureen," she called softly, her voice thin but clear. Maureen, her maid of over 30 years, appeared almost instantly, her footsteps hushed on the carpet. She crossed the room quickly, her gaze attentive and warm, a steadying presence in the quiet tension of the moment. "Yes, Mrs. Aldridge?" Maureen's voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed a hint of worry. She knew Eleanor's condition was worsening by the day, the small fragments of strength slipping away from her with every passing hour. Eleanor's gaze fixed on the Bible, then shifted back to Maureen, her fingers tightening around the old book one last time. She held it out to her maid, pressing it gently into her hands with what little strength she could muster. "I need you to take this, Maureen," Eleanor said, her voice steady but urgent. "Take it to the library on Elm Street. There's a woman there, Sarah, the librarian. I want you to deliver it to her personally. No one else." Maureen's eyes widened, glancing down at the Bible, feeling the unexpected weight of it. She wanted to ask why, to understand the story behind this unusual request, but she kept her questions close. Years of working in this household had taught her when silence was the wiser course. "Yes, Mrs. Aldridge," she said softly, nodding her agreement. A flicker of relief crossed Eleanor's face, though her expression remained solemn. "Thank you, Maureen. And please, don't delay. I don't have much time left, Anne. I need her to have this." Her voice softened, almost breaking on the last few words. Maureen clutched the Bible a little closer, sensing the importance of the task even without understanding its meaning. "I'll make sure it reaches her," she promised, her words gentle but resolute. Just then, a slight rustle from the doorway drew their attention. Frederick Aldridge, Eleanor's only son, stood leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his expression fixed in a mask of polite curiosity. His gaze darted to the Bible in Maureen's hands, lingering a moment too long. "What's going on in here?" Frederick's voice was calm, even casual, but Maureen recognized the guarded edge in it, the way he watched his mother with a quiet suspicion that had been a constant undercurrent in their interactions. Eleanor's face shifted, a subtle steel entering her gaze. "It's only a donation, Frederick," she said, her voice calm, unruffled. "A book for the local library. Something they'll appreciate, I'm sure." Frederick's eyes narrowed, darting between his mother and the Bible in Maureen's grasp. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "A donation?" he echoed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "A worn-out Bible? You have an entire library of rare books in this house, and you're giving away that old thing?" Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile, and her voice held a trace of something almost playful. "Sometimes, Frederick, it's the simple things that matter most. The library is a place for all books, not just the ones with gilded edges." Frederick's gaze hardened, his smirk vanishing as he held his mother's gaze, searching for an answer he wouldn't find in her measured expression. "Mother, with your health as it is, perhaps it's best if you leave these matters to me." His voice softened, the smooth tones of a man accustomed to getting his way. After all, I oversee the estate now. Eleanor didn't flinch, her eyes meeting his with quiet, unbreakable resolve. Frederick, if I wanted your involvement, I would ask for it. But this is something I can handle just fine on my own. For a brief second, a flicker of anger flashed across his face, though he quickly hid it behind a mask of indifference. He shrugged, forcing a lightness into his tone. Fine, Mother. If you want to give away the family's heirlooms one old book at a time, who am I to object? Without waiting for a reply, Frederick pushed himself off the doorframe and left, his footsteps sharp and quick down the hall. Eleanor's gaze lingered after him, a mix of sadness and resolve in her eyes. She exhaled softly, as if she had been holding her breath, her shoulders slumping as the tension in the room dissolved. Turning back to Maureen, Eleanor's face softened. Thank you, Maureen, she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. This isn't just any book, you understand that, don't you? Maureen nodded, though she could hardly begin to imagine what secrets the Bible held. Still, she felt the gravity of Eleanor's request pressing down on her, a silent obligation that stretched far beyond the walls of this room. I do, Mrs. Aldridge, she replied quietly, tucking the Bible close to her side, as if to shield it from view. I'll take care of it. Eleanor's hand reached out to hers, a delicate touch, the frail bones under her thin skin only emphasizing her weakening state. You've been more than just my maid, Maureen. You've been my friend, my confidant. If there's anyone I trust to see this done right, it's you. A lump formed in Maureen's throat, but she forced it down, nodding in silent understanding. Eleanor's words lingered, heavy and poignant, but Maureen knew better than to ask for more. Whatever this Bible meant, whatever secrets it held, those would reveal themselves in time. It was a slow Tuesday at the Elm Street Library, the kind of day Sarah Riley had come to expect. Most patrons were regulars, retirees searching for novels to fill long afternoons, students tucked in study corners preparing for exams, and the occasional mother with toddlers in tow. Sarah liked the rhythm, the predictability, the quiet hum of people drifting in and out. But that morning, amid the familiar routine, a large package arrived at the front desk, catching her completely off guard. She wasn't used to receiving deliveries, much less one addressed specifically to her. The label was plain, almost anonymous, for Sarah Riley. She studied the box, a slight frown furrowing her brow as she brushed off the dust. Donations came often enough, but never personalized, and always in stacks of newer books or the occasional well-loved novel. This felt different, its weight, the air of secrecy around it. She reached for the scissors and sliced the tape. Inside, nestled within a soft layer of wrapping, was an old Bible. Its leather cover was scuffed, the edges fraying, and its pages yellowed with age. There was nothing striking about it, nothing to suggest rarity or value. She touched the cover, running her fingers over the cracks, her curiosity sharpening. Sarah, called a voice. She looked up to see Greta, her co-worker and friend, eyeing the package with mild interest. You good? Sarah nodded, tucking the book back into the box. Just a donation, I think. Looks like it's for me specifically, though. She gave Greta a little shrug. It's just an old Bible. Greta raised her brows, giving a skeptical smirk. They know you're the librarian, right? The last person here who probably needs another book. Sarah chuckled, though her attention drifted back to the Bible. Seems like it, she murmured. But there's something. I don't know. Different. Curiosity gnawing at her, Sarah slipped into a quiet corner of the library during her break and opened the book. Immediately, she noticed faint scribbles in the margins, written in a hand both spidery and elegant, like the words had been poured out in moments of private reflection. She leaned closer, reading snippets of a message. Underscore, to the one who needs to know, underscore. Underscore, a secret kept too long, underscore. Underscore, someday, it'll find its way to her, underscore. The words were cryptic, yet they pulled her in, like echoes of a life hidden in plain sight. She flipped through the pages, watching as the words multiplied, each note seeming to dance between the lines of scripture, a private dialogue layered over holy verses. Whoever had written this had done so with intention, with an urgency she could almost feel. After a few minutes, Sarah closed the Bible, unable to shake the tingling sense that it was meant for her specifically. She couldn't explain it, but something about those scrawled lines felt like they'd been left behind for her eyes alone. There was a mystery in these pages, one that seemed to ask for patience, maybe even a little faith. She knew it was silly to feel attached to an object so soon, but the weight of the Bible, its worn edges and hidden messages, felt personal, like a puzzle left in her hands. Making a quick decision, Sarah wrapped it back up and tucked it under her arm. She wanted to take her time with it, to unravel whatever story it held in the quiet of her own space. That evening, when she stepped through the door of her small apartment, she placed the Bible carefully on her kitchen table. The room was warm, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. She sank into a chair, exhaling slowly, the package resting between her hands as if cradling something delicate, something treasured. Opening it once more, she began flipping through the pages, her eyes sweeping over the scribbles. Some of the notes were simple, almost cryptic reflections on life, comments about grace, forgiveness, time's unforgiving pace. But others were raw, vulnerable, tiny confessions that felt like whispers. How do we find courage when the past holds us hostage? I made choices for him, for the family. But someday she'll know, She paused, a slight shiver running down her spine. Who was this woman? The words had the weight of a lifetime etched into them, a story that had somehow managed to escape history's shadows and land here in her hands. As she read deeper, Sarah began to realize the scrawled words were not simply random notes, they were fragments of one person's life, words written with such fervor and feeling that they leapt off the page. These weren't just reflections but confessions, hidden in the corners of a book that looked like it could disintegrate at any moment. Page by page, the story seemed to hint at something kept in the dark, a life sacrificed for reasons that were left unspoken. The name Frederick appeared a few times, but without any further detail, a passing mention here, a bit of reference there. Her eyes skimmed over a faint line on one page, barely legible. One day, she'll know the truth. The thought struck her as strange, the mystery deepening. She flipped through more pages, feeling as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, peering over but unable to see the drop. Who was this she? What truth was meant to find her, and why had it come here, to Sarah's desk, on a sleepy Tuesday in a library tucked away in a quiet town? Finally, her eyes landed on a passage that seemed written with a kind of urgency, the ink smeared as if by a shaky hand. When the time is right, this will reach her. She'll know her place, her rights. She'll know who she is. Sarah leaned back, the meaning heavy and elusive, yet undeniably personal. A strange sense of connection washed over her, a curiosity she couldn't shake. Her life had always been ordinary, simple, and there'd never been much reason to question it. But now she felt like someone had handed her the first clue in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Before she closed the Bible for the night, she ran her fingers over the worn cover, feeling a surge of gratitude for the life it represented, whatever its story might be. Maybe tomorrow she'd understand more, maybe tomorrow the words would unravel into something tangible. But tonight, she let herself sit with the mystery, feeling the warmth of something long hidden, something strangely beautiful, resting in her hands. As she finally tucked the Bible into her bag, preparing for bed, she felt the first glimmers of excitement unfurl in her chest. Sarah Riley had always lived a quiet life, marked by routines and small, meaningful pleasures. She grew up in a little house on the edge of town, raised by her adoptive parents, Martha and Jim Riley, two of the kindest, most unassuming people you'd ever meet. They were working class, Jim a mechanic and Martha a clerk at the local grocery. The Rileys weren't wealthy, not by a long stretch, but they taught Sarah that a good life was built on honesty, hard work, and kindness. The house was small, a single story with chipped paint and a squeaky screen door that had been there as long as she could remember. But inside, it was cozy, filled with warmth, the scent of Martha's baking, and endless shelves of books, her true haven. She often escaped into stories, filling her world with characters and lives so different from her own, worlds beyond the confines of her town. Books had shaped her, becoming her closest confidants, her guides. From an early age, Sarah knew she was adopted. Martha had told her on one of those warm summer evenings when she was 8 or 9, her mom's voice gentle as they sat on the front porch, watching the stars come out. "We found you at the convent," Martha had said, stroking Sarah's hair. "Sister Cecilia called us the day you arrived, and the moment we saw you, we knew you were meant to be ours." There'd been no anger in Sarah's young heart, no sense of abandonment, just a faint curiosity about the woman who had carried her into the world. Sometimes, she'd wonder if they'd looked alike, if maybe her eyes or her laugh came from someone she would never know. But her life with the Rileys was happy, and the questions about her origins became a soft hum at the back of her mind, one that surfaced only now and then, in quiet moments. Sarah's love of books was encouraged by her parents, though they didn't have much in the way of formal education themselves. When she was 12, Jim built her a small wooden shelf in her bedroom, a place for her growing collection of novels, picture books, and hand-me-down paperbacks from the town's library sales. She would spend hours with her nose in a book, lost in worlds far beyond their small town, her imagination spinning tales of grand adventures and unknown family histories. It wasn't much of a surprise when she announced, fresh out of high school, that she wanted to work in a library. Her mother had smiled, pride and affection brimming in her eyes. "I can't think of a better place for you, sweetheart," Martha had said. "Books have always been your friends, haven't they?" Working as a librarian had become not only a job but her calling, a part of her identity as real as her quiet kindness or her small, gentle smile. In her job, she found joy in helping others discover stories, guiding children to their first books, and supporting students through their studies. Every book she touched, every shelf she organized, felt like a small tribute to the life her parents had given her. She felt rooted, stable, content, almost. Yet, in the quietest hours, she'd feel a soft, nagging sense of something missing. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the echo of the old story Martha had told her about her adoption. She knew she'd been left anonymously, that no one at the convent knew who her mother had been. There'd been no note, no identifying blanket, not even a name. Sometimes she wondered if her mother had thought about her over the years, if she was even still alive. Had she loved Sarah in her own way, or was her memory of that brief life she'd brought into the world hidden away somewhere she couldn't or wouldn't revisit? The questions had no answers, and as the years went by, she learned to live with them, pushing them aside. Life had a way of balancing out, she supposed. She had been given love and stability, and if that came with the unanswered question of her past, then so be it. That night, though, as she lay in bed, her fingers tracing over the worn Bible she'd brought home from the library, she felt that question surge back up, raw and powerful. The old, weathered cover under her fingers was alive with possibility, with an unknown story that felt far too familiar. Her mind lingered on the Bible, flipping through the cryptic words she'd read earlier in the evening. Those scattered notes hinted at regrets and decisions hidden away, of truths waiting to find their way to the light. She'd seen the name Frederick scrawled in a few places, and she couldn't help but wonder if it held any significance. Could it be someone from her past? The thought was impossible to shake. Sleep didn't come easily, her mind swirling with the fragments of the life hinted at in the Bible, a life layered with mystery and heartache, as if she were somehow a part of it. She pulled herself back from the thought, reminding herself that she didn't believe in things like fate or destiny. And yet, this felt different. When morning came, Sarah found herself craving the comfort of her old routines. She brewed coffee, took out a worn novel she'd read a dozen times, and tried to settle back into her life's usual rhythm. But the Bible sat on her kitchen table, its presence magnetic, demanding attention. She had intended to return it to the library's shelves, but now the idea felt wrong. She didn't understand it, but something in her knew this book belonged to her. On her way to work, she tucked it into her bag, feeling its weight against her hip as she walked down the sidewalk. With every step, memories of her own childhood came rushing back, the warmth of the Rileys, the security they had built around her, and the steady, unshakable love they'd given so freely. And beneath that comfort was the quiet ache of a question she'd carried all her life, one she'd thought she'd laid to rest long ago. The days drifted by slowly, and each night Sarah found herself returning to the Bible, curling up in the quiet of her small living room, a single lamp casting a warm glow as she read. She never rushed, savoring each line as if it were a piece of someone's soul, captured in ink. The scrawled notes were mesmerizing, the handwriting elegant but slightly uneven, as though it had been written with a trembling hand, perhaps in moments of intense emotion. The words felt sacred, not because they shared the pages with scripture, but because they seemed to come from a place of raw, unfiltered truth. Some notes were written like prayers, others like confessions. The early passages were delicate, brief reflections that hinted at a life deeply intertwined with faith, but burdened by secrets. Words like forgiveness and redemption appeared again and again, as if the writer was trying to will them into reality, trying to write their way into peace. How do we find courage when the past haunts us so? Grant me the strength to forgive myself for the choices I made for him, for us. At first, Sarah had assumed the notes were random musings, perhaps lines written by someone who used the Bible as a diary. But the more she read, the more she sensed the shape of a story in those fragments, a story about love, betrayal, and sacrifice. The mystery of it all captivated her, each line an invitation to peel back the layers and see what lay beneath. One night, she came across a passage scrawled in the corner of a psalm. The handwriting was bolder, darker, like the writer's hand had pressed harder with emotion. To the one who must know, forgive me for waiting so long to do what is right. The words struck her, chilling and hopeful all at once. She paused, rereading it, the message weighing on her chest as if it were meant for her. But how could that be? She pushed the thought aside, burying it like an ember she couldn't let grow. As the nights went on, the entries became more desperate, the words heavy with guilt. There were notes about a son, someone whose name Sarah had seen repeated throughout the book, Frederick. He seemed to be at the heart of the writer's struggles, a name written with equal parts regret and tenderness. I made choices for him, for his future. He'll never understand, but I had to. How can one reconcile love with the choices that hurt others? Sarah's heart ached at the words. She felt as if she was reading a confession meant only for the writer's own heart, a mirror held up to a life full of hard choices. She thought about her own life, the childhood she had known, the security of the Rileys' love, and how different her life might have been if fate hadn't led her into their arms. Days turned into weeks, and each evening she found herself drawn back to the Bible, finding fragments that seemed to speak to her, almost like pieces of a puzzle left just for her to solve. But there was no picture, no full story, only glimpses through the eyes of someone long gone. One rainy night, Sarah sat with a cup of tea, the room filled with the soft patter of raindrops against the window. She was close to the end of the Bible, though she tried to ignore the sadness that came with it. Somehow, reading these passages had begun to feel like a conversation, one that had quietly woven its way into her heart. She flipped the final page, expecting to find another note, maybe a last reflection. But instead, something slipped out and fell softly onto her lap. She reached down, her fingers brushing against a piece of cream-colored stationery, its edges slightly worn. Curious, she picked it up, noting the elegant script written in black ink, the handwriting the same as that of the note she'd read through countless times. The note was short, but every word seemed to burn into her as she read it. To the one who finds this, you may not know me, but I know you. You are not a stranger to this story. If you are reading these words, it means you were meant to have this, to know the truth. My wish is that you'll come to understand why I did what I did, and that you will forgive me. Underscore. Sarah's breath caught. She blinked, barely processing the words, as if they didn't quite belong to her reality. She read on, her fingers trembling. Underscore. If you are ready, I ask that you present yourself at the Aldridge Mansion on Tuesday, at noon, where my will shall be read. There is a place for you, a rightful place that is yours to claim. Please, come. It is time for you to know who you truly are. Underscore. The note was signed simply with the name underscore Eleanor underscore. Sarah's hand shook as she stared down at the signature, her mind racing, her heart hammering in her chest. Eleanor Aldridge. She didn't know much about the Aldridge family, only that they were among the wealthiest in town, a powerful family who had always seemed distant, untouchable. She knew the mansion, of course, a grand structure sitting on a hill just outside town, looming over Elm Street with its sprawling gardens and high iron gates. But the Aldridges had never crossed her path. Or so she'd thought. The Bible lay open in front of her, the pages filled with Eleanor's confessions, her secrets, her regrets. And suddenly, those words felt heavier, more personal, as if they were no longer just stories but revelations meant to be seen by Sarah, meant to find their way to her specifically. Sarah sat there, the rain whispering against the glass, her hand still clutching the letter. The air seemed to pulse with the significance of it all, the weight of a truth she had yet to understand but could feel pressing against her chest, urgent and undeniable. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, Eleanor's words pulsing in her mind. She read the note over and over, each line unraveling more questions, none of them offering answers. What did Eleanor mean by rightful place? How could a woman she'd never met have written as though Sarah was meant to inherit this Bible, as if she were connected to the Aldridge family in some deep, impossible way? She finally drifted into a fitful sleep just before dawn, only to wake hours later, feeling more exhausted than before. She stumbled into her kitchen, still dazed, and set a pot of coffee to brew. The Bible sat on the table, its worn leather cover a reminder that the events of the previous night were real and not the remnants of a strange dream. Her mother, Martha, stopped by later that morning, bringing groceries and her usual cheerful demeanor, which instantly softened when she saw Sarah's face. "Honey, you look like you've been up all night," Martha said, setting the bags on the counter and peering at her with concern. "Is everything okay?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes falling to the Bible on the table, her hands instinctively covering the note that lay beside it. She didn't know how to start, but the story poured out of her in pieces, the strange package, the Bible's scrawled notes, and finally, the letter signed by Eleanor herself. When she finished, Martha's face had lost its usual brightness, replaced by a mix of disbelief and concern. She reached out, touching Sarah's arm as if to ground her. "Sarah, are you sure this isn't someone's idea of a joke? Maybe someone from the library?" "I thought that at first," Sarah said, her voice a whisper. "But no one at the library would go through all this trouble, not for a prank like this. And this handwriting, it's so intimate, so real. Whoever Eleanor Aldridge was, she meant for me to see this." Martha sat down, clasping her hands as she studied her daughter. There was something pensive in her expression, a deep worry that Sarah hadn't seen often. "Eleanor Aldridge," Martha said slowly. "I remember her vaguely. She was the matriarch of the Aldridge family, kept to herself, didn't appear much in town. Her son, well, he has quite the reputation." Sarah nodded. "Frederick. He's mentioned in the Bible notes. I think he was a part of whatever Eleanor wrote about." She glanced down, frowning. "And if I'm supposed to be at the reading of her will, then this could change everything." They sat in silence, both of them staring at the Bible. Martha looked as if she wanted to reach for Sarah's hand, to pull her back from whatever was unfolding, but she held back, her gaze clouded with worry and something else, maybe a hint of the same curiosity Sarah felt. "Do you think I should go?" Sarah asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. What if this is real? What if it's my chance to understand things I never could before? Martha's face softened, and she reached out, squeezing Sarah's hand. I don't know what's waiting for you at that mansion, Sarah, she said gently. But if Eleanor left you that Bible, maybe she wanted you to find the answers. And if you don't go, you'll always wonder. I'd hate to see you live with that question hanging over you. They weighed the possibilities, talking through their fears, uncertainties, and the implications. Frederick Aldrich wasn't known for being charitable or kind, and the idea of Sarah walking into his world as some unknown link in the family seemed like the plot of a novel rather than her real life. But beneath her own hesitation, she felt a growing sense of purpose. She needed to know why this stranger had reached out from the grave, asking her to come forward. By the end of their conversation, they had come to a quiet agreement. Sarah would go to the Aldrich mansion. She would step into Eleanor's world, if only to find out why the woman had wanted her there in the first place. On the appointed day, Sarah found herself in front of the Aldrich mansion, its grandeur intimidating even in the light of early afternoon. The iron gates loomed ahead, a reminder of the family's wealth and legacy, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of self-doubt. She looked down at her plain, sensible coat and second-guessed her choice to come alone. But the thought of Martha's steady encouragement reminded her that she wasn't really alone, not in spirit, at least. Taking a deep breath, she walked up the long driveway, passing rows of carefully manicured hedges and pristine gardens. When she reached the front entrance, a tall, stately door with an ornate brass knocker, she paused, feeling her heartbeat thrumming in her chest. She hesitated just a moment before raising her hand and knocking, each tap echoing back at her. The door swung open, and she was greeted by a man in a tailored suit, his expression formal, his gaze assessing. He nodded briskly. "Miss Riley, I presume?" "Yes," she replied, her voice a little unsteady. I was asked to come for the reading of Mrs. Aldrich's will." "Of course. Right this way." He led her into the house, the smell of polished wood and leather filling the grand entry hall. She caught glimpses of opulent rooms as they walked, their heavy furnishings and gilt-framed paintings exuding a wealth that was far removed from her simple life. When they reached the drawing room, the man gestured her inside. She entered, feeling a strange mix of awe and apprehension as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Her gaze swept over the people seated in the room, lingering on a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an expression of cold curiosity, as she seated in a chair in the back of the room. He looked her over with a detached intensity, his face a mask of cool arrogance that made her feel like she was being scrutinized under a microscope. This had to be Frederick. And from the lack of reaction, he probably thought she was some kind of assistant to the lawyer. The lawyer cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. He was an older gentleman, neat and composed, carrying a worn leather folder he opened with care. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured. "We are here to honor the final wishes of Eleanor Aldrich." Frederick's eyes shifted to the lawyer, his jaw tense, his gaze hardening. Sarah felt his hostility radiate across the room like a dark cloud, and she couldn't help the chill that ran through her. But she squared her shoulders, feeling the note in her pocket as if it were a lifeline. The lawyer turned to her, his gaze briefly softening as he spoke. "Before we proceed, Mrs. Aldrich left explicit instructions to invite a specific individual here today, someone with whom her legacy is deeply intertwined. Miss Sarah Riley, would you please step forward?" As Sarah rose, the room fell into a stunned silence. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, but she kept her chin up, meeting each face head-on, ignoring the flare of resentment in Frederick's eyes. Frederick's face twisted as he stared at Sarah, his gaze piercing and wild. He seemed to realize, with a terrible clarity, exactly why she was here. His voice dropped low, brimming with venom as he looked back at Arthur. "Who is this person?" He spat the last word, eyes narrowing. "Why would my mother want her here?" Arthur cleared his throat, but Sarah spoke first, her voice steady. Eleanor invited me. She left me a letter. Frederick's eyes snapped to her. A letter? He sneered. My mother doesn't even know you. Arthur reached for the letter in Sarah's hand, then passed it to Frederick without a word. Frederick grabbed it roughly, his face twisted in disgust as his eyes skimmed the words. Then, with a strangled sound, he slapped it down on the table, as if even touching it had burned him. Frederick's face turned a shade of red so deep that Sarah half expected to see steam rising from him. He surged to his feet, nearly knocking over his chair as his voice boomed through the room. This is insane. A mistake. This girl isn't family. I don't care what that paper says. This is ridiculous, he shouted, his voice echoing against the high walls of the room. Some stranger shows up with a piece of paper, and we're all supposed to bow down and accept it? No. No, this isn't happening. Camilla, her face white with shock after reading the letter, looked at Frederick with wide, horrified eyes. Frederick, what does this mean? Why would she even think of this? Frederick's voice shook with rage. Because she's always wanted to dig up the past. Even now, she couldn't leave it buried. He turned to Arthur, pointing at him accusingly. You should have stopped her. Letting my mother embarrass this family, bring in. Frederick, sit down, Arthur said firmly, though there was an edge to his tone. This was your mother's wish. My mother was senile. Frederick snapped, his fists clenched tightly. She must have been losing her mind if she thought some stranger could walk in here and take what belongs to us. To me. Camilla, still seated but visibly rattled, placed a shaking hand over her throat, her voice sharp and shrill. Frederick, how could she do this? Letting some nobody waltz in here as if she has any right to be here, as if she has any claim on our lives? Frederick. Arthur's tone turned hard, his voice clear and unrelenting. Your mother's intentions were not a mistake. She made every decision with full awareness. Frederick's expression twisted with fury, his jaw tightening as he rounded on Arthur. She didn't know what she was doing, Arthur. You, of all people, should have stopped her. His voice dropped to a dark, furious whisper. She was practically on her deathbed, for God's sake. You should have convinced her otherwise. You should have protected this family from her mistakes. Frederick's fist slammed down on the table, rattling the crystal and silver on display. I will not allow this, he spat, his voice filled with icy fury. No one is taking what's mine. No one. His voice dropped further, cold and venomous. I don't know who you think you are, but you don't belong here. Camilla, pale and rigid, suddenly rose, her expression as furious as her husband's. You can't just walk in here and expect to be treated like you're entitled to this family's life. This is our family, and you. I came because Eleanor asked me to. She left me the Bible, she wrote me that letter. I'm here because she wanted me here. Sarah replied, standing up despite the tremor in her voice. Wanted? Frederick barked a bitter laugh, filled with derision. You think that means anything? That doesn't give you rights. You can't just claim a family because my mother scribbled your name on a note. Frederick's lips curled back, his hands clenching into fists. This is my family, Arthur. Mine. And no piece of paper is going to tell me to make way for some mistake my mother dug up from God knows where. Sarah flinched, but held her ground, watching as his anger erupted, blazing hotter with every word. You know what this is, Camilla? Frederick turned to his wife, his face a mask of fury. This is her way of punishing me. She's always been quick to shame me, to put everyone else on a pedestal while he cut himself off, his voice cracking with frustration. He shot a glare back at Sarah. You don't belong here. I don't care what's in that letter. You don't belong here. Camilla's hand covered her mouth, her voice trembling. Frederick, what did you do? Frederick froze, then looked away, his jaw tight, face dark. I did nothing. She's the one bringing scandal into this family, not me. Enough. Arthur's voice was like a whip crack, and the room fell into stunned silence. Frederick, Camilla, Eleanor's choices will be respected. You will sit, and we will proceed as instructed. Frederick glared, his expression dark with unspent anger, but he finally sank back down, his face tight, his gaze on Sarah still radiating resentment. Camilla sat beside him, her lips pressed thin, her eyes fixed on Sarah with icy accusation. Arthur adjusted his glasses and took a measured breath, opening the folder with Eleanor's will. The room was silent but charged, the air thick with anticipation and anger. Frederick's glare was fixed on Arthur, simmering with fury barely held in check, his hand twitching as if he might rip the papers from the lawyer's hands. Arthur's voice was calm, steady. Eleanor Aldridge's final wishes are as follows, he began, casting a quick, empathetic glance at Sarah before continuing. Her entire estate, property, financial assets, and holdings, are to be passed to Frederick Aldridge. Frederick's shoulders relaxed slightly, his face easing, as if some dark cloud had lifted. But Arthur barely paused before he continued, his voice unwavering. However, he said, enunciating each word clearly, this inheritance is contingent upon one condition, that Frederick Aldridge fully acknowledge Sarah Riley as his daughter, providing her with all rights and provisions equivalent to those of any child born to him. Frederick went utterly still, the color draining from his face. His fists clenched and unclenched, his eyes darting between Arthur and Sarah as if hoping one of them would deny the words he'd just heard. What did you just say? His voice was low, dangerous. Arthur met his gaze without flinching. Your mother's terms are that you publicly recognize Miss Riley as your daughter, and grant her the same rights, inheritance, and respect afforded to any legitimate child. A choked sound escaped Frederick's throat, his face twisting in an expression of raw fury. No, he growled. She can't. I won't. This is unthinkable. His voice rose, echoing off the walls of the grand room. How dare she? How dare my mother tie my own inheritance to this? Frederick. Arthur's voice was firm, cutting through Frederick's tirade. Your mother made these decisions with full legal counsel. If you wish to claim the estate, you must accept the terms. Frederick's eyes were blazing, his face pale as a storm of emotions crossed it, anger, disbelief, and something close to despair. You mean to tell me, he hissed, that everything I've worked for, every scrap of this family's legacy, is being held hostage unless I accept her? He pointed at Sarah, his finger trembling with rage. Camilla gasped, a horrified look crossing her face as she looked at Arthur, desperate for him to say there was a loophole, some escape. Surely there's a way to reconsider, she whispered, her voice taut with panic. Arthur shook his head, his expression regretful but firm. There is no reconsideration, Mrs. Aldridge. Eleanor's wishes are binding. Frederick must fulfill this condition, or the estate will be directed to Eleanor's charitable foundation. Frederick's mouth twisted with rage, and he let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Charity. Charity. He looked at Camilla, his face flushed with humiliation. My mother would rather give away the Aldridge fortune than let me control it without this absurd concession. He turned back to Arthur, his face twisted in desperation. And if I don't? If I refuse to acknowledge her, then what? Then the estate will bypass you entirely, Arthur replied. Your mother made that very clear. She wanted to leave a legacy of integrity, and this is the only way she believed that could happen. Frederick's breathing grew shallow, and for a moment, he seemed on the verge of a full breakdown. This is a betrayal, he screamed, his voice breaking. All my life, I did everything she asked, I protected this family's reputation, and this is how she repays me? Arthur's voice softened, though he remained steady. Frederick, your mother hoped this would be a path to reconciliation. She wanted you to correct the past, to bring peace where there was only pain. But Frederick shook his head, barely listening. He rounded on Sarah, his eyes dark with hatred. "This is your fault," he hissed. "You're taking my life, my family, my inheritance, do you understand that?" Sarah, who had been standing in stunned silence, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of Arthur's words, felt her knees buckle. Her vision blurred, the room spinning as the revelation crashed over her. "No," she murmured, barely above a whisper. She stumbled backward, the weight of the moment pressing down until her legs gave way, and she collapsed into a nearby chair. Arthur rushed to her side, steadying her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Miss Riley," he said softly, concern etched on his face. "Take a deep breath." But Sarah was lost in a whirlwind of thoughts, the weight of Eleanor's final request, of Frederick's resentment, overwhelming her. This family, this man, they were hers, in some twisted, painful way. The man raging before her was her father, and the fortune she'd never dreamed of was tied to her existence. She looked up, dazed, catching Frederick's glare, and a terrible sadness filled her. Frederick pointed at her, his face dark. "I don't care what that document says. I don't care what promises my mother made." He took a step toward her, his voice dripping with venom. "You may have weaseled your way into this, but I swear, you will regret it." Sarah felt her hands shaking, her mind barely able to process the fury directed at her. But she met his gaze, her voice faint but clear. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just came because she wanted me to know the truth." Frederick's laugh was cold and bitter. "The truth?" he spat. "You're a stain on this family, that's the truth. And if I have anything to say about it, that's all you'll ever be." He whirled around, pacing the room like a trapped animal, hands clenched in frustration. Arthur spoke up, his voice low and compassionate as he addressed Sarah. "Miss Riley, you are not at fault. Your place here is valid, as was Eleanor's intention." But Frederick turned on Arthur, his anger renewed. "Intention? What about my intentions? What about the family's legacy? She had no right to throw this stranger into our lives, to manipulate us all from the grave." He turned back to Sarah, his voice a low growl. "You don't belong here, and you never will." Camilla, still seated, clutched her hands together, her eyes flitting between her husband and Sarah, torn between disbelief and shock. Her voice wavered as she looked at Frederick. "Frederick, what now?" Frederick didn't respond, his face set in stone. The only answer was the silence that filled the room, heavy and unyielding. The papers were signed, the accounts transferred, and suddenly Sarah found herself staring at a checkbook and a stack of official documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she ran her fingers over the embossed family crest on the Aldridge stationery. The wealth and properties listed in her name felt like an abstract puzzle she could hardly piece together, each line of text more surreal than the last. She sat at her small kitchen table, the room too quiet, feeling the weight of the inheritance Eleanor had left her. She had been thrust into a life she didn't understand, and she was alone with it. She didn't have the faintest idea how to begin managing such sums or how to navigate the obligations that came with this new status. Her only guide had been Eleanor, and now even her guiding hand was gone. Sarah's days felt like they passed in a dream as she attempted to balance her old life and this strange new one. Then, one evening, she received a call. The voice was calm, polite, and, unexpectedly, warm. "Sarah, this is Martha Aldridge," Frederick's wife said, pausing as if weighing each word. "I was wondering if you'd like to meet. Just you and me." Sarah hesitated, thrown by the offer, but agreed. Curiosity outweighed her trepidation, and she wanted to understand more of Eleanor's world, and perhaps her own place within it. They met at a quiet cafe in town, away from the sprawling estate. Martha arrived punctually, impeccably dressed, her presence graceful yet softened by a gentleness Sarah hadn't seen at their previous meetings. As they ordered coffee, Martha leaned in, her voice low and kind. "I wanted to talk to you, woman to woman, she began, her eyes meeting Sarah's with a glint of sincerity. This can't be easy for you. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, the tension in her shoulders easing as she nodded. I didn't expect any of this. It's overwhelming. I can only imagine, Martha said gently. Frederick, well, he's not easy, as you've seen. He's had his share of mistakes, of moments he's not proud of. And it's a lot to unpack all at once. A strange relief washed over Sarah at Martha's words. It was as if, finally, someone was acknowledging the unspoken truth that had been stifling her. Thank you for understanding, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't ask for this. I'm just trying to honor what Eleanor wanted. Martha smiled, a little sadly. Eleanor saw something in you, something worth bringing to light. She was always strong-willed, but her heart was kinder than most people knew. Martha paused, her gaze softening. And I believe she wanted you here to be part of the family, even if it took the rest of us some time to understand it. Sarah bit her lip, touched but still cautious. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now, though. I have no idea how to manage what she left me. It feels like a foreign language I can't understand. Then let me help you, Martha offered, her voice calm and reassuring. I know this world, and I want to help you make sense of it. Eleanor left you with the resources to build a life here, and I think she'd want you to feel welcome in it. Martha reached out, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. Come to family gatherings, meet people who knew her. You're part of this family now. Sarah hesitated, taken aback by the warmth in Martha's tone, but she found herself nodding. That would mean a lot, she said quietly, feeling the unexpected sting of tears in her eyes. A few days later, Sarah attended her first family gathering. The Aldridge estate, daunting as ever, had been transformed for a charity auction Eleanor had arranged long ago. Frederick was there, his face a mask of barely concealed irritation, but with Martha's quiet encouragement, he offered Sarah a stiff, reluctant apology. Frederick's words were clipped, spoken as if every syllable chafed, but Martha stood beside him, a gentle hand on his arm, and his tone softened. I apologize for how I acted, he said, each word coming out like it was being forced. I didn't handle the situation well. Eleanor's decisions caught me off guard, and I reacted poorly. Sarah accepted his apology with a simple nod, the exchange as awkward as it was necessary. The apology didn't erase the past, but it cracked open a door, however slightly. And it was a start. Over the following weeks, Martha kept her word, guiding Sarah through the complexities of her inheritance. She taught her about the Aldridge charities, the investments Eleanor had made, and even the properties Eleanor had specified should be kept in the family. With each lesson, Martha's kindness bridged the gap between their worlds, grounding Sarah in a reality she was slowly coming to accept as her own. One evening, as the late autumn sun dipped low, Sarah found herself standing at Eleanor's grave, a single white lily in her hand. The quiet was comforting, the breeze gentle. She knelt, placing the flower down as she let her thoughts drift, speaking softly as if Eleanor could still hear her. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. I don't know if I'm worthy of it, but I'll try to be. She lingered a moment longer, feeling the weight of her gratitude and the bittersweet knowledge that she'd never had the chance to know Eleanor while she was alive. But in her heart, she understood that Eleanor had known her, and that somehow, Eleanor had seen what even Sarah hadn't known was within herself. Sarah returned to the library the following Monday, her favorite corner already waiting with stacks of books to shelve. Her colleagues greeted her warmly, but there was a hint of awe in their expressions now, a silent acknowledgement of the transformation that had changed her life yet left her rooted in this place she called home. She knew she'd always need the grounding stability of the library, a familiar space where she could breathe and remember the life she'd known before everything shifted. Despite the financial freedom Eleanor's inheritance had given her, Sarah couldn't imagine leaving the work she loved. She wanted to keep the world of books and quiet corners, of guiding young readers and sharing stories with elderly patrons who'd come to count on her. The library was where she felt most herself, a place where she could stay grounded while still finding her own rhythm. But as she stood that morning, placing a novel back on its shelf, a thought settled into her mind, one that had been nudging her gently for weeks. It was time to challenge herself again, to step further into the world she'd always dreamed of knowing more intimately. She needed something more, something that could blend her past with the future Eleanor had given her. She wanted to return to school. She'd always loved history, and now the idea of studying it, truly understanding the stories behind the dusty tomes she handled every day, felt like the next natural step. She pictured herself in a lecture hall, books spread before her, listening to a professor's voice filling in the spaces of her knowledge with things she'd never had the chance to study formally. It was exhilarating and terrifying, a future she had barely dared to imagine. That night, she sat across from her adoptive mother, Martha, at their small kitchen table. Martha was listening intently, her face a mixture of pride and excitement. "I think it's wonderful, Sarah," she said, her hand covering Sarah's as if sealing her approval with the warmth of her touch. "You've always had that thirst for knowledge, that curiosity. I'm so proud of you." Sarah smiled, feeling the grounding weight of her mother's support. "Thank you, Mom. I know it's a big step, but it feels right. And maybe now I can do some of the things we talked about all those years. I want to see the places we read about together." A spark lit Martha's eyes as she laughed. "I'd love that, Sarah. We dreamed so big when you were little, didn't we? Paris, Rome, Vienna, so many places." "Yes," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "And now, we can actually go." Their first stop was Paris. They walked along the Seine, where Martha marveled at the booksellers and street artists, her eyes bright with the same joy and curiosity she'd shared with Sarah in their countless bedtime stories. They spent days exploring the city, wandering through art galleries and neighborhoods, tracing the streets they'd known only from novels and postcards. Under the golden lights of the Eiffel Tower, they toasted to the journey, laughing like schoolgirls as they clinked their glasses of sparkling water, savoring every moment. Rome followed, a city of history layered upon history. As they stood before the Colosseum, Martha's hand slipped into Sarah's, and together they traced the ancient steps of the Romans. The weight of history, of lives that had come before, settled over Sarah with a newfound appreciation. This was the world she was stepping into with her studies, and it felt both grand and humbling. Their next stop was a quieter dream, an Irish village, tucked against the cliffs and rolling green fields. They stayed in a tiny cottage, where they fell asleep each night to the sound of ocean waves crashing against the rocks below. Martha, wrapped in a warm shawl by the fire, would read passages from Eleanor's Bible. Sarah had brought it along, knowing the journey wouldn't be complete without it, and each evening they shared moments of quiet reflection, honoring Eleanor's memory in the places she had hoped Sarah would come to see. With each new city, each moment of awe, Sarah felt herself growing, not just in knowledge, but in understanding. She could see Eleanor's legacy clearer than ever. The inheritance wasn't simply money, but a chance to grasp life fully, with curiosity, kindness, and courage. By the time they returned home, Sarah was ready to embrace the future she had been building piece by piece. She enrolled in a part-time history program at a nearby university, balancing her days between the library and her studies. She filled her evenings with books on art and antiquity, on genealogy, and the histories of ordinary people who had left their marks on the world, quietly yet indelibly. Her return to school opened doors she hadn't even known existed. She met professors who encouraged her to explore her heritage, to dive deeper into the ties that connected her to Eleanor's family and history. The more she learned, the more she felt rooted in herself, each piece of knowledge a thread linking her to the past and guiding her into the future. And through it all, Eleanor's Bible was always there, waiting for her on her nightstand, a reminder of the journey she'd taken and the life she was continuing to build. The notes Eleanor had left, scribbled in the margins, were no longer mysterious messages to a stranger. Now, they felt like personal reminders, small fragments of courage from Eleanor to Sarah, gentle nudges to keep moving forward with purpose. One evening, as Sarah sat by the window with the Bible open in her lap, she came across a line she hadn't noticed before. It was written in Eleanor's careful script, the ink slightly smudged as if she'd lingered over it. Our lives may begin in ways we do not choose, but they are ours to shape. Sarah traced the line with her finger, letting the meaning settle within her. She was living that truth, honoring her past, embracing her present, and, for the first time, looking forward to a future she dared to shape herself. In the end, it was simple. She was both Eleanor's granddaughter and Martha's daughter, each a part of her as real as her love of history or her place at the library. And, with a life fuller than she'd ever imagined, she knew she would carry both legacies forward, one grounded in the quiet, steadfast love of her mother, and the other, a gift from Eleanor, the promise of a life fully, courageously lived.